and so, to save time, the next item of business is a debate on motion 23299 in the name of Richard Leonard on additional support for Scotland's tourism and hospitality sectors during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Richard Leonard to speak to and move the motion. Mr Leonard, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I begin by referring members to my register of interests. This week we have all welcomed a message of hope, the prospect at last that there is a COVID-19 vaccine on the horizon offering hope in place of fear. But here in Scotland there is another fear which still hangs over us, the fear of mass unemployment, of business collapse, of savings gone and rising debt and deepening depression. This is the fear which keeps people awake at night. It afflicts too many of Scotland's businesses and working people, and too many, in particular, of Scotland's hospitality and tourism businesses and workers. Businesses facing a huge drop in trading and a huge drop in demand are now at the same time carrying substantial debts. Debts including those to government arising from loans taken out in the first half of the year. In Scotland, almost 80,000 loans, totalling £2.1 billion. So we need that debt repayment rescheduled and some of that debt written off. In the weeks to come, the Scottish National Investment Bank will finally open its doors. The new bank's purpose must not just be to attract footloose foreign direct investment, it must be there first and foremost for the indigenous business base at its time of need. That must be its priority. And to the commercial banks, we say that just as we were there for you to keep afloat jobs and even entire banks in the global financial crash, so we now expect you to be there for us to help keep afloat jobs and businesses in the wider economy in the face of this crisis. Over the last 6 months, restaurants in the Central Belt have experienced the first lockdown, then the lifting of restrictions with social distancing measures in place, the Eat Out to Help Out programme in August, which boosted demand for at least the first half of the week, and then the subsequent Central Belt circuit breaker, and now Tier 3 restrictions. This imposition of rule after rule would be confusing, even if it had been plotted from the start of the year, but it hasn't. It has been, in the words of the First Minister, ad hoc. Of course, we all recognise the unpredictability of current circumstances, but the government's response to each wave of this pandemic has been imposed without a clear exit strategy, leaving businesses and workers fearful for what might come next. And time after time we have seen a complete failure to communicate, a complete failure to consult, to share the evidence, a complete failure to respect the business community and the workers affected. Businesses cannot be turned on and off like a tap, and they should not be treated as though they could. The restaurant owners I met in Glasgow recently explained how their bills do not stop even though they are wholly or partially closed. Many of them shed half of their workforce in the first lockdown, and more have gone since. Which is why we say that the case for additional support for these jobs, for these businesses, for these entire industries is unanswerable, and that is why we oppose the SNP amendment to our motion today. The Scottish people are doing their bit, so the Scottish Government must do its bit as well. That's why this afternoon Scottish Labour is calling for an immediate review of the level of hardship support and business grants that are currently available, and additional support to be provided. Unions, business leaders must be involved in this process too, which is why we will support the Tory amendment on this basis. Additional grants should be conditional on the businesses which receive them respecting their workers, with standards like those set out in the Unite Hospitality Charter, a real living wage, rest breaks, equal pay for young workers, transport after midnight, minimum hours contracts, anti-sexual harassment policy, proper consultation on changes to rotas, 100% tips to staff and trade union recognition. I have heard it said, and I read it in the Scottish Government Strategic Framework document, that the Scottish Government, and I quote, will not be able to protect every business, and financial support cannot replace all lost income or save every job. But Scottish hospitality alone employs over 9% of the whole workforce of Scotland. That's over 250,000 workers. It's worth over £10 billion to the Scottish economy. So I get it that all that income cannot be replaced, but these businesses and these workers want a government that is on their side, that is prepared to find additional support, and one, incidentally, that is prepared to back, not oppose, the bill before this Parliament on tied pubs, which will provide statutory protection for tied pub tenants at a time when they need it more than ever. Today is a chance for this Parliament to come together, to come in on the side of businesses under intense pressure, to show working people across Scotland that we want to defend jobs and that we are serious about a Fair Work Scotland, that we are on their side when they need us most. A chance to show that we are in partnership with the people, that we are doing our bit as a Parliament, and that we are prepared to back a message of hope for the future with action and practical support now. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Leonard. I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to and move Amendment 23299.2. Cabinet Secretary, 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, there can be no one in this chamber today that does not recognise the scale of the devastation that this virus has wreaked on Scotland's tourism and hospitality sectors. Since March, when COVID struck and lockdown began, the impact on individuals, on businesses, on lives has been devastating. And I doubt there's anyone in this chamber that has spent more time since March engaging with those people. Every day, Presiding Officer, reaching out to people whose lives have been impacted in this way. And I'm just started. And I'm absolutely determined to continue with that work, as are my parliamentary colleagues. This week we have heard good news on a potential vaccine. But even with the vaccine, Presiding Officer, the impact of this virus will be measured in years, not months. Business in the sector, from leading visitor attractions to the smallest Highland pub, are now unsure whether they will survive to the spring. The Scottish Government has, from the beginning, recognised the scale of this impact and the need to provide adequate support for business survival. It has not been possible, as Mr Leonard appeared to imply, that we could simply replicate every pound of revenue that business has lost. It is practical to aim to provide lifeline business support, sufficient business support to help businesses survive. And that realistic target is the one that we have pursued. I am absolutely confident, incidentally, Presiding Officer, that businesses recognise that that objective is one that is both realistic and also our determination to deliver. No, I must make progress, very little time. So, the Scottish Government has invested £2.3 billion in business support. The non-domestic rates-based retail, hospitality and leisure grant scheme, helping those most affected with over £1 billion. £14 million allocated to larger hotels, with £4 million for smaller B&Bs and self-caterers. The Tories are muttering under their breath as usual, but I can assure you, Presiding Officer, that this support has been truly appreciated by business. I know, because I've been speaking to them. Our pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund has also provided funding for business with a rateable value in excess of £51,000. When I suggested this, Presiding Officer, and my colleagues agreed that it should be provided, it was in recognition of the fact that many hotels have rateable values over £51,000, and they would not have any access to grant finance. This scheme was provided in Scotland. It wasn't matched in England, and it met the gap for many family businesses and hotels who otherwise would not have navigated this difficulty. But more needs to be done. The task is not done because the tunnel in which we're in has proven to be much longer than any of us hoped. And whilst there is some light at the end, we're not there yet. So the Tourism Task Force brought together 30 key stakeholders, including our trade unions, to ensure how we can best ensure the sector's survival. Its recommendations provide a framework for recovery, and they chime well with the valuable work being done, for example, by Unite the Union's Hospitality and Tourism Rescue Plan. I hope the Labour Party will support the reference to that work, good work done by Unite, when it comes to the voting this afternoon. But we can only work for the levers we have, and they are not enough. Presiding Officer, we will continue to provide urgent support to the tourism sector. I care deeply about it. I work with people like Jackie Bailey, as she well knows, on numerous occasions, and I will continue to do so, even if I can't take her
Cabinet Secretary, keep on the good side of the presiding officer too while you're at it. I don't think you moved your amendment.
So
I now call, and I gave Richard then a little extra, so I will compensate to you, Mr. Mundell. Call on Alderman Mundell to speak to and move Amendment 232299.1, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's hospitality and tourism sector has been in crisis since the pandemic began. And while the vaccine brings hope to many, for others there is continued uncertainty with a long, cold, dark winter ahead. Thousands of jobs remain at risk, with a growing number of businesses teetering on the edge, having burnt through reserves and financial capacity to borrow. While the extension to furlough by the UK Government has been widely welcomed and represents an unprecedented level of support, the question now is whether many of the businesses in the hospitality and tourism sector and its supply chain will be here in the spring in order to re-employ people. That's why it's so important that the SNP Government stop picking fights with the UK Government and prioritise getting the money they've already had out the door in order to protect jobs and businesses in every sector and region of Scotland. Time is of the essence, and that's why we're supporting Labour's motion today and feel that the SNP amendment is simply an attempt to detract attention from their own failure to properly consult and engage with the sector or deliver on the funding schemes pledged. Of course, you can call for more resources from other governments, but before you do so, you have to actually demonstrate a commitment to using the funds you've already received to back these vital jobs and businesses. Turning now to our own amendment, which I move in my name, I increasingly believe that a Business Advisory Council is essential moving forward, alongside meaningful trade union engagement, because I have no doubt that the poor consultation and tick-box approach adopted by this government when it comes to the introduction of new measures is playing a significant role in creating unnecessary problems and flashpoints. By formalising the process and making it more transparent, perhaps the Scottish Government would feel under more obligation to listen to those on the front line of the growing jobs and economic crisis that we now find ourselves in. And perhaps they would be willing to explain the reasons for discounting some of the productive suggestions that have come forward. The Scottish Government is of course right to say that new public health measures remain the priority, and that no one, even those who are seeing their livelihoods put at risk, dispute that, Presiding Officer. But the question here is how are things being implemented, and whether or not the financial support that's been put in place reflects the pain and hardship this SNP Government, and by association this Parliament, is asking those in the hospitality and tourism sector to absorb. As one leading hotelier said to me just last night, these requests for additional support are not about greed, they're about pure survival, and we cannot afford to let one of the mainstays of our economy and the many jobs it supports be put at risk. As I get through what is a short speech, Presiding Officer, I can simply ask fellow MSPs, do we want to unite round a clear and simple motion as proposed, with a reasonable addition to highlight the importance of the wider supply chain and the need to engage with employers as well as unions? Or do we want to allow a government who've been slow to listen to rewrite the message that today's debate sends? If we believe that the hospitality and tourism sector and its supply chain are important, now more than ever, they need to know that Parliament have their back. Scotland is rightly proud of the outstanding businesses and attractions and opportunities on offer, and we must all do our bit to make sure that this vibrancy is protected for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part in this debate, and I'm very pleased that the Labour Party have chosen to bring a motion on this topic for debate to the Chamber. I think we are, as others have said, all painfully aware of the impact that the pandemic has had on the hospitality sector, on tourism, and on the people working in those businesses. A survey that I carried out with my own constituency showed that 80% of respondents working in the sector are working fewer hours. Half are extremely concerned about their income security, their jobs, and a great many are either calling on the government to support employers to pay the real living wage, or in fact are already looking for work elsewhere and don't see that they can have a future with a decent prospect working in the industry. So we need to take that reality very, very seriously, but we also need to see it in context. This is an industry with a very long track record of endemic low wages and exploitative working conditions. We need to be realistic about the need to drive up standards and not see those who've taken on a responsible approach to issues like the living wage becoming the ones who get tipped over the edge and be the employers that get lost. I was a bit surprised when I saw the motion in the first instance that it doesn't go into a lot of the detail about some of the things that Richard Leonard included in his speech, like the great work that Unite Hospitality have done, not just their charter, but the tourism and hospitality rescue plan that they've produced. So I lodged an amendment that talked about some of the actions, yes, being reserved, but some being very clearly devolved responsibilities the Scottish Government could take forward and should. I hope that members will agree with what was in my amendment, even though it wasn't selected for debate. I think the Conservative amendment, I worry about the intentions here. I worry about the possibility. The kind of advisory group they're calling for would simply end up becoming a lobby against the public health measures that we know are necessary. If it's about how best to implement or to mitigate, then I can understand that. But I would be deeply concerned if it became a lobby group within government against public health measures, and I do think it carries that risk. As for the SNP amendment, the government amendment does bring in some of the issues that I talked about, including the work of Unite Hospitality. And I might well have found myself voting for it if it didn't also ask us uncritically to welcome the recommendations of the industry's task force. That task force report, the recommendations in that report, far too many of them were just reheated grievances from the Scottish Tourism Alliance. They're calling for the abolition of air passenger duty. Do we really think that air passenger duty is the reason why we've seen an impact on tourism and hospitality? Of course not. They're calling for the abolition of the transient visitor levy, which isn't even enforced yet, and no local authority is even close to proposing its use. These issues are a distraction. And the only mention I could find, the only mention in their report of wages was a call to have a relaxation on requirements for the living wage. Perhaps, Presiding Officer, that's what you get when you have a task force with 36 members, only 2 of whom represent the workforce, only 2 of whom represent the people who actually do the work in this industry. So I'm afraid I'll be voting against the amendments. I do support the motion, and I hope that members across the chamber will support many of the issues that we raised in our amendment, even though it isn't being pressed to a vote.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. Now call Willie Rennie. Mr Rennie, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. One of the joys of representing North East Fife is that there are so many creative people who have transformed the local tourism and hospitality offer. The Michelin star Pete Inn, Muddy Boots at Balmalcolm, the Anstruther Cheese Farm, Lindores, Abbey Distillery, and many more across the area. Innovative people who have invested their money and their hearts into making a success of it. I can't name them all. I have deliberately left out some because they are really struggling and don't need the attention just now. I have helped so many get grants, and I am grateful for the engagement of the Economy, Finance and Tourism Secretaries to make that happen. But despite that help, many are now on the edge. It could be just a matter of weeks before they collapse. And if they collapse, we will have lost good businesses that make money, employ people, pay the taxes to pay for our public services. But we will lose more than that. We will have lost the innovators, the business people who may not try again. And if they do, it will take an age for them to get back up to the level of economic activity that we need. So the clock is ticking. We invested so much earlier this year to keep these businesses alive with grants and furlough and the self-employment support. The UK government finally listened to the pleas to extend furlough, but they need to go further and extend it even longer. I just don't believe that businesses deliberately go into hibernation when they could be operating and earning a profit. But we need more with the grant support to help the missing millions, those excluded from the financial sector. Yes, briefly.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Rennie, for giving way. Could I assure him I entirely agree with what he said thus far. This government is committed to providing further lifeline assistance to business. It recognises it is necessary in addition to the furlough, and it is working as a matter of urgency and a top priority on providing a fair package to achieve that objective.
Mr Rennie, you get your time back.
Well, that is very encouraging to hear, and I hope that comes to reality. But if you'll forgive, I think, the Parliament for wanting to put a little bit more pressure to make that happen. And that's why I will be supporting the Labour motion today, and I'm afraid not the Minister's amendment, because I think what we need to do is to put a little bit more pressure on the government to make this happen. I do fear for these businesses, and I think by voting for the Labour motion today, I think we will make sure that emphasis is there. And I do understand why the Finance Secretary has mirrored the Westminster packages of support. It is probably the best way of guaranteeing that Westminster covers the cost of those grants here. But we do need a review of the current grant schemes, as too many are losing out. Businesses without premises were unable to get grants through the business rate scheme. Businesses that are not required to close, but their activity is so restricted, they may as well close. They do get the hardship fund, but that's less than a third of what is provided to businesses that are closing. Passenger agents, local holiday booking agents, they haven't closed throughout the pandemic because they've spent the last few months getting the money back for their customers, not earning a single penny in the process. Now, the Northern Ireland Government, I hope the Minister's listening carefully to this, the Northern Ireland Government, I understand, are looking at a scheme to fund that sector, and I hope that the Scottish Government follows suit as well. So we will be supporting the Labour motion today, and I hope the Government does go that extra mile to make sure this sector is supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The open debate, I call Colin Smith, to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has used Scotland's hospitality sector as a scapegoat in this pandemic. Despite what the Cabinet Secretary said, it has failed to recognise the scale of the contribution our third biggest employer makes to Scotland's economy, providing over 250,000 jobs and adding £6.5 billion to our economy. Hospitality was the first sector pushed into lockdown. It will be the last to have the grip of that lockdown loosened, and it suffered a disproportionate level of job losses due to inadequate government support and the imposition of continually changing restrictions that are rarely backed up with evidence from government and are often contradictory. And let me just give you one example of that inconsistency. On the 23rd of October, the Government published its so-called COVID Strategic Framework. A few days later, it provided more detail on what this meant for hospitality at each level. Level 2, for example, they said all pubs could remain open to serve soft drinks inside or alcohol with a main meal, and outside soft drinks or alcohol with or without a meal. We debated that framework. The First Minister answered questions on the imposition of its levels. Yet the next day, the Government published regulations that closed all non-food pubs at level 2 upwards from last Monday. It utterly contradicted the very framework we had debated, and no hint whatsoever was given in those debates by the Government that they were even considering this. Now, I get why they took that decision at the time. It looked at the time that legal closure was the only way to allow those pubs to claim support from the UK Government's planned new closed job support scheme. But on the Saturday, the 31st of October, that scheme was withdrawn and the existing job retention scheme was extended for a month. It has since been extended until March 2021, and like all my Labour colleagues, I want that extension to continue beyond that period. But that extension to March means the Government's regulations to close wet pubs are no longer needed. Those pubs can access the furlough scheme whether they are closed are open. So I'll happily give way and take an intervention for any SNP member who wants to get to their feet, tell the pubs in my region, many of whom invested significantly in outside areas to meet previous government restrictions, why the government have not scrapped the regulations closing their pubs, which we know are now no longer necessary and are completely unfair. Well, not a single member has taken up that offer. No wonder. I'll take up John, yeah.
John Mason.
Would the member accept that there has been a problem in pubs and other places serving alcohol just with people getting together? We cannot have as many people getting together as we were used to. Does he accept that point?
So Mr Mason is effectively saying that the Government's framework that said those pubs could remain open were wrong. If that was the position of the Government, they should have said so in the first place, instead of being dishonest and saying that was the position before passing regulations that closed pubs. How dare the Cabinet Secretary say he's concerned about pub closures when it's his regulation that are closing pubs, contradicting what the Government said in this chamber just the day before. No wonder, Presiding Officer, the sector has been forced into unprecedented steps of taking this Government to court as they fight to save their sector. But today in Parliament, we've got an opportunity to unite together to support our hospitality and tourism industry, to show we're on the side of the sector and saving jobs, and show we're on the side of the workers and protecting and improving their terms and conditions. No reasonable person could object to the terms of Labour's motion today, so it's disappointing the Government isn't prepared to show that support or that solidarity. Let's be very clear what voting for the SNP amendment means. It means voting to remove from Labour's motion a clear commitment to additional support for the sector, and it means voting against using that government support to protect and strengthen the terms and conditions of workers. And Cabinet Secretary, I have to say, you don't need to bring an amendment in Parliament to ask yourself to meet with the trade unions. You just need to start to do your job properly. Presiding Officer, no one disputes that our #1 aim must be to control this virus. COVID-19 is first and foremost a health crisis. It continues to take a terrible toll on our fellow citizens. But too often, when people raise perfectly legitimate questions, offer alternatives, ask to see the evidence for actions, point out the inconsistencies like I've done today, highlight the economic crisis of COVID, they're unfairly dismissed, brushed aside, accused of being careless about public health by this Government. That's what's happening to our hospitality sector, when what they need is support and a recognition of the work they do to support our economy.
Thank you. I did give you extra time. I call Stuart McMillan, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate, and I know that the hospitality sector has been one of the hardest hit in the economy, and I, like everyone else in the Chamber, will have spoken to many organisations in my constituency, particularly those within the hospitality trade, and certainly those in the hospitality trade that have expressed their frustrations, their anger, their welcome and also their aspirations about what has happened so far, but also about what they want to see for the future. I'm going to come back to constituents' points in a moment, but it's clear that the impact of the coronavirus in Scotland has been profound, and my constituency, sadly, has had the highest level of deaths per head in the country. Now, this is a challenge. This is the biggest challenge that society has faced in our lifetimes, and the measures that we take to deal with it must reflect the magnitude of what we face. And the steps taken in Scotland to contain the virus are very much unprecedented and they have changed life as we knew it. While we know that the current lockdown measures are absolutely essential right now, we also know that they have damaging consequences on their own, consequences for our economy, for our living standards and also our physical and mental health. I welcome the introduction of the furlough scheme in March by the Chancellor and also welcome the recent decision by the Chancellor to extend it to March 2021. I believe, however, the delay in announcing the extension until the 11th hour will have cost jobs. Some employers will have already taken that difficult decision to make people redundant because they expected the scheme to be withdrawn. I also welcome, however, the Chancellor's indication that as in March, the employers will be able to bring back people that they have made redundant and include them in the furlough scheme, which may go some way to addressing some of the job losses. However, Dr Liz Cameron's comments, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, her comments last week I thought were really interesting in this particular point. And I quote, "This announcement gives Scottish businesses a glimmer of hope that we may be able to survive and work through this crisis. What we cannot do is to continue with uncertainty, which is impacting business confidence, employee motivation and also our ability to plan and invest. However, the furlough scheme alone will not be enough to save businesses, so the Chancellor must continue and expand his commitment to providing businesses with guaranteed grant support to help businesses recover." I only have 4 months, I'm sorry. I also welcome the extension of the UK Government's Self-Employment Income Support Scheme and confirmation that the level of grant will be 80% of average trading profits for the period of November to January. However, I indicated that I was going to highlight some constituents issues. I do agree with Dr Cameron's comments, but I also share, when these comments are shared by local hospitality businesses, businesses have still got fixed costs to cover: electricity, gas, insurance, amongst many others. If they can't trade, if they cannot trade, then all the funding mechanisms that actually have been provided thus far, including the furlough, the wide number of the Scottish Government grants, including the hardship grant, the grant outlined in the strategic framework, from the 2nd of November onwards, of between £2,000 to £3,000, depending on the rateable value, will be available for businesses required to close. The small business bonus, the addition to 100% relief from non-domestic rates for properties in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors, and also the earlier £10,000 grants and the £25,000 grants. If businesses do not have some type of consistency in the future in terms of UK government policy, then all of the monies that have been invested thus far to try to help businesses, particularly in the hospitality sectors, will have been for nothing. I agree with the strategic framework, and I believe it's the right mechanism for the present situation. And I did touch upon this last week, and I can see you're telling me to wind up, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, businesses need that stability, and whilst I welcome this debate, I also welcome the fact that governments have been working together, but if the UK government do not want to do more, then give this Parliament the funds and give this Parliament
funny
the
how
powers
winding
to do
up
so.
stretches
Thank you very much.
Yes, but funny how winding up stretches to half a minute. Winding up means winding up on the spot. Murdo Fraser, and I know Mr Fraser will do that.
Oh, I'll do it, I'm told. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Bear a minute, we shall see. Murdo Fraser followed by Claire Baker. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the Labour Party for bringing forward this debate on support for Scotland's tourism and hospitality sectors. And the importance of these sectors cannot be overstated. They are particularly important in rural parts of the country, including areas such as Perth and Kinross and Fife that I represent in this place. And tourism is the largest employer in Scotland overall, but in rural communities the impact is much greater. And it is a sector which has had a roller coaster ride over the past year. The initial restrictions in the spring caused a crisis in the sector, followed by hope in the summer. With the easing of restrictions, with many people taking holidays at home rather than travelling abroad, there was a boom in tourism in many parts of the country, and that was boosted by schemes such as the Eat Out to Help Out scheme from the Chancellor Rishi Sunak. But now we see new restrictions being introduced, and I've heard too many deeply depressing stories just in the last few weeks of cancelled bookings as a result of new travel restrictions being introduced, and individuals who have spent their lives building up a business now fearing for the future. Just yesterday, it was announced that both Perth and Kinross and Fife will move from Tier 2 to Tier 3, with new restrictions on travel and hospitality, making an already serious situation even more difficult. And this is where the Scottish Government needs to step in. It needs to use the substantial resources that have been put at its disposal to provide more direct support for hospitality. And let me just make this clear, both to the Scottish Government and to SNP backbenchers. At the start of the last month, additional funding by the UK Government to the Scottish Government was a guaranteed £6.5 billion. Since then, just over the last few weeks, that figure has gone up. We've seen an additional funding provided of another £1.7 billion. And that money has not been allocated, according to what the Finance Secretary said just a few hours ago in this chamber. And that means there are currently hundreds of millions of pounds sitting in the Scottish Government's bank account, unallocated, money that is available to help the sector. They need to stop sitting on this money and start paying it out to those in need. Otherwise, a health crisis is going to become a jobs catastrophe. Now, Presiding Officer, there are two specific sectors that need assistance that I want to highlight. And the first is the pub sector that Colin Smith referred to in his remarks. But there are many pubs in the area I represent that do not have outside space and do not serve food, and therefore effectively had to close a few weeks ago when restrictions were brought in. And yet they were only able to access precisely one-half of the grant support available to those in the Central Belt, £2,155 as against £4,310 for pubs in Glasgow or Edinburgh. That's an issue the Scottish Government needs to address and make sure there is a level playing field. And the second sector of businesses that have been hard hit and have seen very little support are those involved in the wedding industry. Wedding venues have seen virtually their entire business for the year disappear. I've heard of weddings which were booked for the spring of this year, cancelled and then rebooked for the autumn, cancelled and then rebooked again for spring 2021, and where brides are now being contacted by venues and being told that that date cannot be guaranteed. It is a disaster for wedding venues who are having to survive on zero income with no certainty for the future and no ability to take forward bookings or deposits. And there is a wider knock-on impact from the cancellation of weddings to all sorts of other businesses, to taxi businesses, to wedding dress suppliers, to florists, to those involved in marquee hire and cater hire. Gordon's Cater Hire in Blairgowrie wrote to me this week, raising concerns about the lack of a clear route out of restrictions and how the sector has not had specific support when it has been made available to others. Already one company in this sector has been forced into liquidation this week, and the fear that others will follow unless more can be done to assist. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government does have more money at its disposal. It needs to start using that money to support businesses on the brink of collapse. It needs to step up and start delivering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Fraser. And I call Claire Baker to be followed by John Mason. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As everyone has recognised, the experience of lockdown and pandemic restrictions has been particularly difficult for hospitality and tourism. It has been a difficult year, though many got support packages which enabled them to survive through to July, when a short season started and gave the opportunity to create some income. Most businesses then spent hundreds of pounds on screens, sanitisers, signage and employed additional staff while reducing their capacity. Tourism, from self-catering to visitor attractions, invested to change the way they operate and reduce the risk to visitors. There has been very little evidence provided that hospitality or tourism have been responsible for an increase in cases. And where that was seen to be the case in Aberdeen, there is a strong argument that it was the behaviour of individuals rather than the establishment. And there's an argument that any irresponsible trader should be closed rather than the whole sector, the vast majority of whom have provided safe environments for people with an expense to their business at a very difficult time. I'll briefly mention the role of historical and cultural tourism. There has been a significant overall package to culture, but with little signs of reopening and tiers introducing further restrictions for cultural tourism, the viability of our museum sector, which is the second biggest driver for tourism visitors to Scotland, is at risk. The support packages have been welcomed, but they have been oversubscribed, and we need to see a share of the additional business support which is coming to Scotland, recognising the pressures the cultural sector is facing in coming months. Since the 9th of October, when the circuit breaker was announced and the subsequent tier framework has been introduced, the sector has been facing a very difficult time. The delay in announcing the Coronavirus Restrictions Fund and the extremely short timescale for businesses to close didn't fully recognise the impact on the sector. When the Welsh Government introduced a fire break, they announced £300 million of business support with a £5,000 support for hospitality businesses with a rateable value below 51k. I accept it can be difficult to compare different approaches, but support for an equivalent business in Scotland was £2,875, which is now either £2,000 or £3,000. That is still £2,000 less than the equivalent support that's been offered in Wales. Hospitality businesses in Tier 2 are not forced to close by law, but the measures in place so suppress their businesses that they are effectively unable to operate. For those who don't have to close, the Business Restrictions Grant is discretionary and it is a lower level of support. There are businesses who are excluded from any support, and I would call on the Scottish Government to provide flexibility to local authorities to provide support where it is needed. I have this week had representation from a catering hire business who received no support and aren't being classed as hospitality, and a recording studio rehearsal rooms who aren't able to access the business restriction support, even though they're virtually closed due to household restriction numbers. And it's now clear that wholesale businesses who did qualify for the Coronavirus Restrictions Hardship Fund are excluded from the new fund. For those that do receive support, the levels risk being inadequate to compensate for closure or reduced business and risks permanent closures and job losses. I do know that the Cabinet Secretary meets regularly with representatives of the hospitality and tourism sector, but they are too often reporting a lack of understanding over the impact of the decisions. Some decisions appear arbitrary, such as the ongoing ban on background music, or lack an understanding of how the sector is structured. For example, the cap on the number of bars that can receive support diminishes the support that larger operators are receiving, though they are often the larger employers. The restricted sales of alcohol present significant difficulties for the profitability of hospitality, and some argue it is self-defeating as it leads to an increase in house parties. I visited a food bank in Fife last week, and they're reporting an increase in referrals as people are made redundant in the hospitality sector, and the extended furlough scheme came too late. And a recognition that hospitality jobs are often insecure and that people are too easily dispensable. I support Unite the Union's Hospitality and Tourism Rescue Plan, and I welcome MSP's comments on it. The hospitality and tourism sector, which gives so much to Scotland, is facing a crisis, and it does require greater government response. Thank you.
Thank you. I would stress to members that we don't have much time and we're creating 4-minute speeches from members. I call John Mason to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne. John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in today's debate. Firstly, I would say there are a number of things in the Labour's motion which I would certainly agree with. They are right to describe the balance that we're all facing with COVID, trying to protect people on the one hand, but not damaging the economy on the other. It seems to me it is like steering a ship in a storm through rocks. If we go too far one way, we hit the rocks of increased infections, with hospitals swamped and potentially more deaths. But if we go too far the other way, jobs and entire businesses could be lost. Secondly, I agree that we should be working with the trade unions, with the primary aim being to protect jobs. Terms and conditions should be maintained as well, although I fear that some reduction in hours is almost inevitable in some organisations. And we should not lose sight of improving terms and conditions, especially for those who are poorest paid and with the worst terms and conditions. I think it's worth remembering that although some businesses, especially in tourism and hospitality, have been very seriously affected by the pandemic, other businesses have done relatively well, and they should not be using COVID as an excuse to push down their staff costs. In fact, some, like online suppliers, are seeing an upturn in profit and a chance to treat their workers better than before. However, there are some parts of the Labour motion which I have more problems with. To suggest that, quote, no hospitality or tourism business faces closure, unquote, is sadly unrealistic. Absolutely, we should seek to minimise closures, but I fear some are not going to survive this. And to suggest that there should be no job losses, again, is sadly unrealistic. Some jobs have already gone, but yes, we should be seeking to minimise these job losses. The next problem I have with the motion is the call for, quote, Scottish Government to provide additional support, unquote. I do not believe the Scottish Government is sitting in a pot of available and uncommitted money. It is, in fact, nobody intervening, but you're all shouting. In fact, the UK Government is not sitting on money either, but is borrowing, and I'll give way to Murdo Fraser, yes.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to Mr Mason for giving me. Clearly, he was not in the chamber at finance questions earlier this afternoon. He would have heard my question to the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, about this money, and she confirmed this money is unallocated in the Scottish budget. It's sitting there waiting to be spent.
John Mason.
I think Murdo Fraser plays with words to some extent. I mean, I do accept that some of the money has not yet been spent, but somebody has to pay for ScotRail over the next 3 or 4 months. Somebody has to compensate for the lack of tax that's coming in. Somebody has to look at whether local government needs more money. No, I'm not taking a second intervention. So I think the Conservatives are being disingenuous this afternoon, suggesting there's extra money sitting around. In fact, of course, the UK Government also does not have extra money sitting around, but they just borrow it more and more and more. And we can continue with increased borrowing in the short term, but in the long term, we certainly cannot continue borrowing at this level. Apart from anything else, it is totally unfair to expect our children and our grandchildren to pick up the pieces in the future while we do not contribute what we can afford today. Because some individuals and some organisations have done fine through the pandemic and restrictions so far. Many of us have not seen a fall in our wages and salaries. Many have saved money because they could not go out for meals, they've not commuted, they've not paid childcare, they've not gone on holiday, and so on. So there is room, and it was suggested today by the Scottish Human Rights Commission at the Finance Committee that we should be looking at least considering raising taxes. So, yes, we need to be looking after as many workers and as many people in the sector as we possibly can, but we need to be hard-headed and realistic, which doesn't go well with Labour. We need not least to look at where the resources are coming from in order to build this fairer society that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mason. Michelle Ballantyne to be followed by Shona Robertson. Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would refer the Chamber to my register of interests. Last week, the South of Scotland Destination Alliance conducted a flash survey of the sector on the impact of the new tier system and lockdown in England. The results are stark. 90 to 100% of bookings are cancelled, an estimated loss of over £1 million, 500,000 of this directly due to our new Scottish tiers. From hotels and restaurants, bingo halls to visitor attractions, time and money has been invested making themselves COVID safe. This has meant reducing footfall and adjusting to new systems. But redundancies are mounting up as businesses in the sectors close their doors permanently or reduce their staff in an effort to survive. Confusion is setting in. The new system of funding for businesses is yet to be announced, leaving no clear understanding of what support is now available, despite the UK Government making available an extra £1.7 billion to the Scottish Government. 3 weeks ago, the manager of the Cringletty Hotel near Peebles, along with other prominent hoteliers, signed a letter to Nicola Sturgeon calling for changes to restrictions to protect jobs. The requests in that letter were ignored, and as a result, the Cringletty Hotel has been forced to close its doors until at least Christmas. As the manager stated, there is not much point staying open if we can't welcome any guests. The Waverley Castle, a coach tour hotel that brings thousands of tourists from across Europe to Melrose every year, shut for good in the summer. For decades, visitors to that hotel have boosted the local border's economy. Staff have lost their jobs, and some even lost their homes. The Crieff Hydro Group, who own the Peebles Hydro, were faced with no other option than to let more than a quarter of its workforce go, some several hundred jobs in total. These closures and many others mean that laundries, food suppliers and ground maintenance businesses are also impacted. Companies like Belhaven Trout Company have been refused support but form a key part of the tourism supply chain. For every hospitality and tourist venue that closes its doors, a supply chain of jobs is hit also. Businesses like these are essential for the hospitality and tourism sector's recovery in Scotland, and we cannot afford to drive them out of business. To put it in context, in 2018, there were 421,000 domestic and international overnight visitors just to the borders, a significant growth on the previous year and resulting in revenue of around 80 million. Eating out was the second most popular activity for those on domestic day trips, probably because the most popular was taking a long walk. And let's be clear, whilst the furlough scheme has been essential to survival during lockdown, surely this chamber can understand that the fixed costs of any business still accrue even when revenue disappears. Furlough alone is not a panacea. The summer season has come and gone, Christmas is all but cancelled, and few businesses have any reserves left. If we are serious about protecting hospitality and tourism sector, we need to let it operate. We need clear guidance that is not contradictory. We need to allow residents to eat out locally in COVID-safe restaurants and enjoy a glass of wine. We need supply chains to be protected and supported when they have nobody to deliver to. We need a proper testing system in our airports so Scottish hotels and venues can welcome back overseas visitors, particularly those from Europe, our biggest customers. And above all, we need a Scottish Government that listens and engages with the sector. Presiding Officer, the sector does need action, and it's not the UK Government they're waiting on. Our colleagues in Westminster have made good on their promises of furlough and support. Now it's time for the SNP to step up as well.
Thank you very much. And I call on Shona Robertson before we move to closing speeches. Shona Robertson. Although, Ms Robertson, I think you might need to flip your camera to the other direction.
My apologies, Presiding Officer. Yeah, sorry about that.
I think we'll get a nice picture of the vase on your table.
Hello.
There we are. Thank you. Thank you, Ms Robertson.
Apologies, I've done that so many times, but there we go. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to firstly take the opportunity to thank all the businesses across Dundee for an incredible effort that they have and are still making to help suppress COVID in what are unquestionably very trying times indeed. And I do hope that through their effort and of everyone in Dundee that we will see infection rates falling and be able to lessen restrictions in the near future, something which of course is vital for our local businesses. Help and advice is also vital for businesses at this time, and local authorities have, from what I've seen, been doing a very effective job to ensure that businesses can access the latest help and advice. Dundee City Council has a COVID-19 business support summary, which is updated when new funding or help becomes available. Clear communication like this is essential to help business plan clearly and access the support that they need. And while the announcement that the UK Government's job retention scheme has been extended to the end of March next year, which is very welcome indeed, the way it was communicated was not good, and many local businesses have told me that they found it very difficult to get information, and we need that to improve. Similarly, the UK Business Interruption Loan Scheme was also extended to the end of January next year, which again was welcome, but communication could have been better. The Scottish Government, in response to the most recent restrictions set out in its strategic framework, has provided additional grants for businesses forced to close and hardship grants for those that remain open but are impacted by restrictions, and of course will cover every 4 weeks of restrictions. The motion also mentions the issue of business and hardship grounds around eligibility and access through the COVID-19 Restrictions Fund. And I undoubtedly, like many of us here, have received a fair few inquiries from business owners in our constituencies looking for guidance and clarity over the support available. Last week, I asked the Cabinet Secretary what discussions the Scottish Government had had with local authorities and banks about the eligibility criteria for the COVID-19 Restrictions Fund, particularly in relation to the criteria which requires those applying to have a business bank account to pay funds into if an application is successful. And of course, we know that because of some of the delays, the banks were not able to open those accounts for those that didn't have them. That I was very encouraged that the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged that the Government was aware of the issue and that they were working to address these concerns. What I would ask if the Cabinet Secretary is able to give any updates on the issue that would be helpful to those affected in my constituency. That would be most helpful. Presiding Officer, I'm very conscious of time, so I will leave it there. I'm very much in touch with local businesses in my constituency and know the difficulties that they are under, and we should come together to support them in any way that we can. I'm pleased to support the Scottish Government amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Robertson, and thank you for bringing your remarks to a close early there. Move to closing speeches. I call Maurice Golden to be followed by the Minister, Jamie Hepburn. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have heard today the degree to which hospitality and tourism sectors and their supply chains have been deeply impacted by this pandemic and the individual stories of businesses brought to their knees throughout this crisis. Interventions such as the UK Government's furlough scheme and its extension until the end of March, combined with specific sector actions such as the reduction in VAT, have clearly provided a lifeline. However, despite the size of the interventions to date, the hospitality and tourism sectors are at breaking point. And as we move into the winter, more and more areas of Scotland move into tighter restrictions. There is no end in sight. The first issue we heard today, as highlighted by Richard Leonard, is that the SNP aren't listening to businesses, and as such, there is a disconnect between the SNP government's interventions and the needs of the hospitality and tourism sectors. That is why we have repeatedly called for businesses to be put at the heart of their decision-making process. I've got to make progress. I've only got 4 minutes. And that's why we continue to propose a coronavirus job advisory council to ensure they are fully consulted. This point is reflected in Oliver Mundell's amendment today. The second issue, as outlined by Murdo Fraser, is that the SNP government have failed to act with urgency when it comes to supporting the hospitality and tourism sectors throughout this crisis. Too often, their interventions have taken too long to get to those businesses in need, and too often they have had to change the criteria for support due to a backlash from business. This lack of urgency is symptomatic of the lack of engagement with businesses. The third issue, as mentioned by Oliver Mundell, Willie Rennie and Michelle Ballantyne, is that the Scottish Government must do more for the hospitality and tourism sectors and their supply chains. The recent £40 million package of support for the hospitality sector was welcome, but the sector have decried it of not being nearly enough. Some receive no support at all. For example, travel agents who have worked continually since March to help their customers obtain refunds, often out of their own pockets, while receiving no support. Or the food and drink wholesale sector, who service 5,000 convenience stores, 38,000 hospitality and tourism businesses, as well as care homes and the public sector. Their turnover is at a meagre 30%. Stock has been discarded and redundancies have kicked in. Last week, the First Minister, in response to my colleague Brian Whittle, assured wholesalers they would get the financial support they need, but it seems they have been left out of the newly published Strategic Framework Business Fund. I hope the Minister or Cabinet Secretary, in closing, will address this point, as they desperately need a specific support package to save jobs. The SNP government are carrying a £500 million underspend from their recent autumn business revision, in addition to the £1.7 billion injected from the UK government they've received in the last 6 weeks. The SNP have at their disposal the means to provide additional sector-specific support to tourism and hospitality sectors and their supply chains. That is why we'll be supporting Labour's motion today. Presiding Officer, I urge the SNP to constructively take on board the points that have been raised today and act faster, go further and listen closely to those businesses who are being deeply impacted by this crisis.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Minister, Jamie Hepburn before I call on Jackie Bailey to wind up our debate.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In the limited time available, probably not be able to cover every point that's been raised over the course of the debate. But let me say at the outset, because there seems to be some suggestion that this administration does not recognise this fact. We recognise the importance of the tourism and hospitality sector to this country. It's not only an important economic anchor in many parts of the country, it's also an important part of the fabric of Scotland, as part of the story of Scotland. And we also recognise that the current situation is hugely challenging for businesses across the board, but in particular for tourism and hospitality. And we have sought to respond. I reject the suggestion that we have not. Right from the outset of the pandemic, we have sought to work hand in hand with tourism and hospitality through the Scottish... No, I'm afraid, ordinarily I would, Mr Mundell, but I will not be taking any today with the limited time I have. But we have sought to work with the sector through the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, through the Tourism Recovery Task Force, with its membership drawn from across the sector. I have to say to Patrick Harvey, I did not think he fairly characterised the membership of that group. Of course, it contains representatives of the employers, but it contains representatives from the workforce through Prospect and Unite. It contains representation from local government, it contains representation from public sector agencies as well, all coming together with that singular focus on ensuring we sustain tourism and hospitality in Scotland. And having mentioned Unite, I want to mention in passing the Unite Hospitality and Tourism Rescue Plan. I thought it was interesting that Mr Leonard mentioned that plan, but when you turn your attention to the motion he has laid before this Parliament, there is not one mention of that plan. And I would point to the amendment that we have laid before Parliament today, which does mention that plan and calls on this administration to meet with the United Kingdom Government to discuss that plan. Mr Smith is quite correct to say we do not need to call on ourselves to meet with the unions. I don't need to be told that. I meet with the STUC and their affiliates on a weekly basis. The unions have been integral to informing the sectoral guidance we pull together. But this is a chance for this Parliament to say to the UK Government they should come to the table as well. And I regret that Parliament looks set to turn their face against doing precisely that. I also want to talk about the Tourism Recovery Task Force, its recommendations published on the 23rd of October, which is very much designed to ensure that we mitigate against the impacts of the virus and protect jobs now, but also ensure the long-term position of tourism and hospitality. And I want to draw Parliament's attention to one recommendation in that report, again reflected in our amendment. That report calls for an extension of the Jobs Retention Scheme. I recognise and agree with the point that it will not alone sustain any sector, but of course it has been a vital part of sustaining employment. And again, it is mentioned in the Unite Recovery Plan as well. So this is a chance for Parliament to restate its position that the furlough scheme should be extended to save the 61,000 jobs it could save in the first half of next year. It was extended until the end of June. I again regret the fact that Parliament seems to be setting its face against doing just that. And lastly, to focus on the Tory amendment, frankly, it is unclear what is being sought. If the suggestion is we are not engaging with businesses, I have to assure them that that is not the case. Since the end of the summer recess alone, ministers have met with business organisations over 160 times. That doesn't include individual businesses that we meet on a daily basis. And if any member wants those details, we'll be happy to provide them. So frankly, the idea we're not engaging with business, it does not hold up either. So, Presiding Officer, I say to the Chamber, this has been a short debate. It has given us a chance today to reflect on the challenges before the sector, to reflect on what we have done, but recognising that there is more to be done as well. And I can assure the Chamber that we will get on with the task at hand. We will continue to support tourism and hospitality in Scotland, not only to survive this current pandemic, to thrive and survive long into the future.
Thank you, Minister. I call Jackie Bailey to conclude our debate.
Presiding Officer, the hospitality and tourism industry is on its knees.
As Richard Leonard said, we had lockdown and travel restrictions, then eat out to help out, then localised restrictions, confusion over what was a cafe and what was not, announcements made with little notice, and now a 5-tier framework. Let me start by actually thanking the Cabinet Secretary. It will probably embarrass him. But I am grateful to him for his regular engagement with hospitality businesses in my area. I'm just not sure that his understanding of the challenges are shared by his colleagues. For the record, we would have supported the Greens amendment and indeed the SNP's amendment had it not removed the need for a review of the grants programmes that they run. We are in favour of extending furlough. We are 100% supportive of the Unite Hospitality and Tourism Rescue Plan. But we want to get beyond warm words and simply blaming somebody else because it's their problem. We need to do something here now. The Cabinet Secretary knows there are problems with the existing grants. Let me give you some examples. The hotel support scheme of 14 million was welcome, but only 30% of applicants got an award. It was vastly oversubscribed, and that unmet need remains. Hoteliers tell me that they are effectively closed, but because they have not been forced to close, they don't qualify for some grants. The coronavirus restriction funds, the hardship fund that is now replaced by the strategic framework business fund, far too narrow in their criteria. Businesses without bank accounts are automatically rejected. Bed and breakfasts are not allowed any assistance from these grants, but they are allowed in England. Supply chain companies are denied assistance unless they provide perishable goods. And it appears that wholesalers are left out from the new framework fund. Suppliers of cleaning and other catering products are denied any assistance, yet they provide important services in jobs to an industry that is all but closed. And the restaurateurs say that this is not just about chefs and waiting staff. They are desperately worried that this will destroy suppliers that help make Scotland a land of food and drink. They also asked me for the evidence that supports the difference in restrictions. Why 6 p.m. closing in Tier 3, but 8 p.m. in Tier 2? Why no alcohol with food when this is an important part of their viability? And if there is to be no alcohol, why can't they then stay open later? Opening from 6 a.m. in the morning is relatively little use. Last orders at 4:30 p.m. mean it is essentially just a lunchtime trade. Where is the evidence of transmission in restaurants? Will you publish it to help their understanding? Hospitality settings are safe places. They address all the requirements to ensure the safety and confidence of their customers and staff. Businesses in the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park tell me their normal markets have disappeared due to the travel restrictions. Short breaks have evaporated. They are effectively in lockdown. They tell me that the extension of furlough was welcome, but for some it came just too late. They had already started the painful exercise of making long-serving staff redundant. Hopefully, the retrospective arrangements means some staff can be re-employed and furloughed. In the meantime, they face a long, hard winter with substantial overheads and no income streams. They will struggle to survive without additional financial support over the next 5 months. Some have already closed their doors for good, with the loss of thousands of jobs. To give hospitality and tourism a chance, the Scottish Government must use the additional resources they have from the UK Government, some £1 billion not yet allocated to provide hospitality and tourism businesses with urgent financial assistance. Start by having an urgent review of all financial support for the sector. Expand the hotel support scheme because it was inadequate and oversubscribed. Extend the criteria in the new strategic framework business fund so that hotels, B&Bs, restaurants, supply chain companies, charitable enterprises and those without business bank accounts can benefit. The Cabinet Secretary is smiling. He knows he needs to do all of this. He needs to ensure that any scheme is open to businesses of different sizes as part of a tourism and hospitality strategy. And yes, support the Unite Hospitality and Tourism Rescue Plan. Get hospitality and tourism businesses round the table. You will get better solutions if you actually listen to them and understand the challenges they face. That's what they want to happen. Presiding Officer, we all want to defeat the virus, but we also need to sustain our economy. Hospitality and tourism businesses are on the brink of collapse with the loss of thousands of jobs. They need our support right now. The Scottish Government have the money to do so. They need to get on with the job before it's far too late.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our debate on additional support for Scotland's tourism and hospitality sectors. Now, the next